What is good? Deepak Chona here, SportsMid Analytics. We got NFL injury updates for you right at the end of week 1 of training camp. No need for formalities, so let's get to it. Starting with Russell Wilson. Now, he's been sitting out with a calf strain. The comments from Wilson and Coach Tomlin suggest it's been a mild calf strain, but he wouldn't be missing out for nothing, especially when he's in the middle of a quarterback battle with Justin Fields. Now, for a quarterback, pushing off of the calf is important in throwing and, of course, scrambling. So there is a real re-injury risk here. And you all remember Joe Burrow from last year. Re-injuries are usually worse than the initial, and therefore I think we got to watch this one a little bit carefully. The return timeline to practice, especially if it's early in the coming week, will help tell us a little bit more about what the severity truly is, because it's common that we hear from the team and from the player that everything is mild right now. Next up, Jonathan Brooks. This is probably our most asked question of the NFL offseason so far. Young running backs average a 4-game ramp up in touches, and the comments on Jonathan Brooks so far suggest that he is going to go slow, which further strengthens the likelihood that he sees this gradual ramp up, where for fantasy purposes, you probably can't really rely on him those first 3 or 4 weeks. Now, the data projects about a 2/3 chance he's active week 1, so it is a little bit to be determined. We'll know a lot more based on how they progress him in training camp. When he returns, the data projects him at about 85% week 1, ramping up and hitting the 95% mark towards the last half of the season. I think you can envision something very similar to Breece Hall's comeback last year, where for fantasy purposes, it was hit or miss in the early phase, and by week 6 to 8 onwards, he really looked like a star. Next up, Anthony Richardson. So Richardson had shoulder surgery on a separation, and there's not a lot of data to suggest that this is going to impact negatively his accuracy. He wasn't the most accurate quarterback to begin with, but most importantly for fantasy, Coach Steichen says he will keep running. Now, if Richardson is running and sliding, he is not necessarily at a higher injury risk, but if he's running and lowering his shoulder, those hits are categorized in our data as very similar to running back hits, and therefore put him at a high injury risk. So we'd imagine that this offseason, the emphasis was on please slide Anthony Richardson. And if that's the case, then we think the running maintains and doesn't put him at a high risk. Then Kirk Cousins. He's reportedly looking pretty solid. I would expect some power limitations in his throwing because he is a right-handed quarterback pushing off of his right calf to help generate that rotational momentum to throw the ball hard. And that's going to be your bullet passes and your deep balls. But we really expect to see more of the quick, short, and intermediate passing game because Atlanta has the strong weapons all around him, good O-line, and of course a strong running game as well. So we think all those things will play into them protecting him. Again, focusing on the quick passing game, I think Kirk Cousins could do quite well there. Next, another quarterback, Joe Burrow. He is cleared for throwing, but he took Friday off, and that is not really concerning to me. What typically happens when you're returning an athlete from an injury to sport is that you want to avoid overuse injuries like tendinitis. So it's very common to give them breaks and days off. And the data here on wrist ligament surgery in the general population, because it's very limited in quarterbacks and NFL players in general, but in the general population, about 90% of people are able to return to full grip strength and full range of motion. And therefore, the data does favor a strong comeback outlook for Joe Burrow, one of our favorites for betting comeback player of the year odds so far. Nick Chubb. He just introduced lateral motion to his recovery. Many of us have seen the squatting of 585 pounds, which is great. It's a great indicator of progress, but really this injury is more about lateral motion and the ability to cut and then take hits. So this is a strong indicator that he is progressing, but the comments suggest he's probably out until the week 6 to 8 range. And if that's the case, even when he does come back, you're probably not going to see a full workload right away. So Nick Chubb, you're really looking at the last third of the season as where he's going to be his best. Then Lamar Jackson. He's fully healthy he was fully healthy in 2023 after 2 years in a row of season-ending injuries, first an ankle, then a PCL. Now, he had an increased running back run rate last year, and that tends to lower the injury rate for mobile quarterbacks on the same team. So with Derrick Henry added to the mix, we certainly expect that trend to continue and if not strengthen. And then we have Erick All Jr. The data projects coming off of an ACL about 80% explosiveness for Erick All week 1. Very high likelihood that he is fully available and playing, as he was just cleared for full practice now. But the ramp up will take about 8 weeks to get him to 90%. So mid-season onwards, he is looking at a very valuable potential role as the tight end for Joe Burrow. Then another rookie, Pearsall of the 49ers. He has a mild hamstring strain. Reportedly, he is likely returning early this coming week, maybe even Monday. There is a mild re-injury risk here, but the data actually only shows concern if it lingers into the preseason. Next, Keaton Mitchell. So the average timeline on Mitchell's December ACL would put him into about late October, and that would put him at about 80% explosiveness. He will very likely be ramped up over about 4 games like we talked about earlier. And with that in mind, you also have to remember Derrick Henry is there, and if he's healthy, there's really no rush to hurry your young running back in. So Keaton Mitchell, probably last third of the season is where you're looking at using him. Until then, probably not. Next up, a pair of Chargers running backs. First, J.K. Dobbins. Now, the Achilles drops running back efficiency about 20% in the first year, so it's a pretty big hit, really one of the biggest hits in all of orthopedics for a running back. There's no info, though, on why he left practice recently. There's an increased risk of a muscle strain in the early return phase from this surgery, and J.K. Dobbins is really pushing up the timeline pretty aggressively. So we have to wonder if something happened there, and muscle strain is really kind of the number one thing on the possibility list that jumps out here. So we have to just keep an eye on when he returns, most importantly. Then his teammate Gus Edwards. So Harbaugh admitted that he had surgery, but wouldn't really tell us any details about what it was or what is happening. Now, based on the very limited information we have, the most likely outcome here would be that he had a knee scope, since he didn't really miss time last year. And if that's the case, it would mean that he's close to 100% by week 1. We're speculating a lot here, but there's very limited info thanks to Jim Harbaugh. But we will keep an eye out for any additional headlines on that player. Then we have Daniel Jones. Now, the data post-ACL for quarterbacks projects a return to his pre-injury passing production, but also decreased rushing attempts and decreased rushing efficiency. That's super important because for a pocket QB, which is what Daniel Jones would become, his health is directly tied to the strength of the O-line. Now, the O-line for the Giants has given us reason to suspect that Daniel Jones is going to be in a little bit of trouble there. We can't really say for sure because they have made moves. They have gotten Andrew Thomas and Evan Neal potentially a little healthier than last year, or at least they couldn't be worse than they were last year. So we'll see how the Giants O-line holds up, but that's definitely something we got to watch for with Daniel Jones. Next up is Cooper Kupp. Now, there's a lot of yellow flags here, no reds, but first off, he's age 31, and Dwayne McFarland wrote a really elite piece of analysis here on the age cliff for wide receivers. It's available on Fantasy Life if you want to check that out. But 31, even for the elite wide receivers, is definitely an area where some of them start to see a real drop-off. And then you add in, also pointed out to me by Dwayne McFarland, his yards per route run versus man, which is an important indicator of how Kupp has been faring and will be faring, has gone over the years from 4.2, which is excellent, to 2.1, down to 1.3 last year. Now, that's not to say that that trend will necessarily continue or worsen, but it is an important indicator in McFarland's model. And then from an injury standpoint, last year's hamstring plus Cooper Kupp's previous ACL reconstruction, though that combined history predicts both a shorter career and more missed games towards the end of that career. So again, no red flags, but a lot of yellows with Cooper Kupp. Not really investing in him this season. Then his teammate Blake Corum. A lot of questions about his 2022 meniscus repair, and did that affect him last year? And will that affect his longevity? The answer to both is probably not. Now, the data on meniscus repairs suggests that the following season, players return to their pre-injury level of production, so I don't think it really impacted him in 2023. If it was fully repaired, as was reported and as Corum actually stated himself, it is unlikely to hurt his career longevity because the meniscus acts as a shock absorber, and if the whole thing heals back together, you probably have similar function to what you had before. Now, a couple of defensive players. Chris Jones for the Chiefs, first off. The comments here from both Jones and Reed suggest a very mild groin strain, but we really need to watch when he returns to the practice field, because if this lingers into the preseason, his re-aggravation risk will be elevated, and furthermore, re-aggravations are typically worse than the initial injury themselves. Then Sam Williams of the Cowboys, just today looks like he tore his ACL. There's very limited info available so far, but they're saying they think it's an ACL, and typically you can feel this just on exam with your hands. And then last but not least, Christian Barmore. He was diagnosed with blood clots, unfortunately. These vary a lot based on where the clot is, what the size of the clot is. They're dicey, and they may sometimes require blood thinners, and that can cost athletes sometimes a year, even more. NBA fans may remember Chris Bosh, who had to sit out a lot of time right after being diagnosed with this. It's a dangerous problem, one that if not treated properly can kill even a healthy person. So best wishes to Christian Barmore. Unfortunately, we may be missing him for some part of the season, if not all. And that's all we got for today. Now, don't forget to check out sportsmedanalytics.com. We got all our updates there, searchable, sortable, customizable, just for your liking to help you win those leagues. Now let's get to it.